Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to recommend some of my favorite fall books. It is officially fall here in the northern hemisphere, and although it doesn't always feel like fall because of global warming, I'm still manifesting that we'll actually get to enjoy that cool, crisp weather soon. And what better way to manifest than to share some seasonal recommendations? Of course, I know it's not the fall season for everyone, but I think that fall reads are really just a state of mind, and these can definitely be enjoyed by anyone, anywhere, at any time of the year. I also want to give a shout out to Jenny from This Story Ain't Over, whose fall recommendations video very much inspired this one. She has a very cool way of doing it where she has a bunch of different categories like vampires, dark academia, cozy fantasy, and then she recommends books within those categories. I think that's a really smart and concise way of doing things that has a little bit of structure built into it, which I desperately need. So I took some inspiration from the categories in her video, which will be linked above and down below, and I added my own categories as well. I'm going to recommend at least 2 books in each category, so let's get started. Starting off strong with Dark Academia, the first book I want to recommend would be none other than If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. I know I talked about this one in my last few videos. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be redundant, but I just think it's a great fit for anyone wanting to read some really cool, vibey, dark academia this season. This has become a bit of a cult classic, mixing together dark academia, thriller, and murder mystery. The story is set at an elite art conservatory where 7 fourth-year students are studying to become Shakespearean actors. As you can imagine, their cohort is pretty small, and because the kind of theater they're doing is very niche, they all kind of get pigeonholed and typecast into playing the same kinds of roles. That is until the cast list for their next production gets a major shakeup, and then suddenly they're all at each other's throats, to the point where one of them eventually turns up dead. This just feels very quintessentially fall to me. I think dark academia or light academia is a great fit for fall because fall is often the season where people go back to school or start learning new things. So if you're looking for a story that has a very immersive academic environment tinged with sinister tension and volatile characters, this would be a great choice. And of course, the Shakespearean elements of the story just feel very appropriately seasonal for me. There's tragedy, there's desolation, there's almost a sort of wistful hopelessness captured in so much of his work that I think beautifully translates to the overall feeling of this story. My other dark academia recommendation is a little more left field. It's Flawless Girls by A.M. McLemore. This came out earlier this year. I think it is absolutely categorically dark academia since it's a dark and twisted story that takes place entirely at this elite and sinister finishing school. It's about 2 Latina sisters, Renata and Isla, who are sent to Alari House to become prim and proper socialites. Isla absolutely hates it there and returns back home within a day, but her older sister decides to stay behind. And when she comes back to visit, Isla notices that she's perfectly pleasant, unnervingly polite, and possibly murderous. Like I said, I do think this fits the bill for dark academia because of the setting, because Isla decides to return to Alari House and put herself through the same education her sister underwent in hopes of undoing whatever's been done to her and discovering the truth. But it's also equal parts horror, magical realism, surrealism, and even thriller at times. It's just a really great story about the violence of gender norms and gender expectations, the weaponization of toxic femininity, the quote-unquote danger that being different presents to the status quo. It's interesting, it's bizarre, it's intense, but it's also incredibly smart. Next, we have the general category of horror, and I want to start off with This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno. This is a cosmic horror story about a happily married couple who decide to buy a smart speaker known as Itza. However, despite the fact that Itza is supposed to make their lives easier, they quickly notice that strange and disturbing things are happening in their apartment. It starts off innocuously enough. They get mysterious packages that no one ordered, music will start playing at any hour of the day, but it stops seeming like a simple malfunction when Tiago's wife dies. I can't even explain what this book did to me. I read it almost 2 years ago and I still think about it all the time. It's one of those stories that absolutely melts your brain and makes you feel like you're staring directly into the abyss. It's cerebral, it's deeply psychological. It takes the traditional concept of being haunted and turns it on its head. And what I love is that it explores all the ways that we not only haunt ourselves, but hunt ourselves. How we siphon away these parts of ourselves in hopes of making ourselves more palatable or acceptable to other people, and just how much we lose by doing that to ourselves. The story is intense, it's original, it's thought-provoking, and I honestly cannot recommend it enough. I do also have to take this chance to once again recommend Monstrillo by Gerardo Samano Cordova. This is billed as a literary horror story. It's set in Mexico and following a grieving mother named Magos, who unfortunately lost her young son, and out of fierce maternal instinct and a distantly remembered folktale, she decides to cut out a piece of his lung and nurture it back to life. This piece of lung grows and eventually gains sentience, but it doesn't grow into the boy she once knew. It turns into this carnivorous, humanoid creature who can never really be accepted by society. However, he does eventually adapt well enough to hide his true nature, but if he ever surrenders to his violent instincts, he will not only destroy his family, but also his precious second chance at life. This is another one of my all-time favorite books. It is an incredible meditation on grief and loss and how those things profoundly change us. Grief necessitates change and vice versa. It's part of grief's nature, and it can't be avoided no matter how desperately we want to cling to the past. I feel like that's what the story's really about. It's about how you can try to dress up grief, call it something else, run away from it, divorce yourself from it entirely, but at the end of the day, it demands to be faced and to be felt. This is a truly incredible and special story that absolutely should not be missed. Our next category is vampires, and I'm starting off on a lighter note with My Roommate is a Vampire by Jenna Levine. This is a fun, cute little rom-com about Cassie, who's a broke artist and desperately searching for a new place to live before she gets evicted. And she happens upon this too-good-to-be-true listing for a super nice apartment in a really great Chicago neighborhood with suspiciously cheap rent. But she is desperate, so she doesn't read too much into it, and she doesn't even really care that her new roommate might be a super weird dude who talks like he's from the Regency era, doesn't know anything about modern day living, and stays out all night on business. This is just a cheeky, charming rom-com, heavy on the rom, heavy on the com, doesn't take itself too seriously, and I think it's a really endearing and refreshing take on the vampire-human relationship dynamic. In this case, Cassie as the human kind of has the upper hand because she knows more about the world as it currently is than Frederick does, and I also like that Frederick is open to learning new things, even at the risk of looking foolish in the process. It's just a funny, slice-of-life romance with a lot of heart. It's a really fun read, and if you enjoy it, I know the sequel/companion just came out recently, so there's also that. On the darker side, I would also recommend Certain Dark Things by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a blend of fantasy, horror, and crime thriller. It's set in Mexico City following Domingo, who is a lonely kid collecting garbage on the streets. One day he crosses paths with an ancient, jaded vampire named Atul, who's trying to escape the city and get as far away from the rival narco-vampire gang hot on her trail as she can possibly get. But with a trail of corpses stretching far behind her, police, crime bosses, and vampires alike begin to close in on her and her accidental companion. The real ones remember that this was when Silvia Moreno Garcia really started hitting her stride and making a name for herself. It was long before Gods of Jade and Shadow, long before Mexican Gothic. I feel like this really solidified her identity as someone who's unafraid to play around with so many different genres. What I loved about this book when I first read it like 6 years ago was that Silvia was able to infuse such a strong sense of place and history in the story where you would least expect it. And she brilliantly brings together the bloody ruthlessness of vampires with ancient Aztec history and adds in some high-octane crime thriller sensibilities to top it off. I think it's super underrated to this day and really, really fantastic. Next, let's talk about haunted houses, starting with, of course, The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. This is a sensational historical horror story set in Mexico during the aftermath of the Mexican War of Independence, where a young lady named Beatriz is reeling from both her father's execution and the destruction of her home. So when the handsome and wealthy Don Rodolfo proposes marriage, Beatriz has no choice but to accept, even if it means ignoring the rumors surrounding his first wife's demise. They move into his spacious hacienda, and it quickly becomes clear that something is deeply wrong with this land and with this place. I love this book so much. It uses the haunted house trope to really interrogate the consequences of colonization, an exploration that's made even more complex by the fact that the main character is mestizo, meaning someone someone of indigenous heritage and Spanish heritage. So in some ways, Beatriz is both the colonizer and the colonized, and that really lends itself to the way the story intimately understands what it means to be haunted, what it means to be continuously subjected to terror and violence. There's great commentary, it messes with your mind, it's scary as hell, and it even has a delicious forbidden romance that I have not stopped thinking about. I cannot say enough good things. For some reason, I don't have a second haunted house book in my notes, but my second choice would definitely be Model Home by River Solomon, which I just talked about in my September wrap-up, so if you want to see why I recommend that one very highly, you can check that out. Switching gears a bit, I wanted to recommend some weird fiction. I just feel like fall is a great time to really lose yourself in something super twisted and strange. Unsurprisingly, I'm gonna start with Organ Meats by K-Ming Chang. This is a bizarre, surreal, strange, horrific little story about these two childhood best friends, Anita and Rainey, who tie matching red strings around their necks and vow to become dogs. By forming this two-girl dog pack, they're testing the reaches of their friendship and their loyalty to each other, especially as Rainey's family is planning to move. But once they're separated, Anita actually sinks into this upside-down dream world that only Rainey knows how to rescue her from. And as Anita's body begins to rot, it's up to Rainey to rebuild Anita's body and save her best friend from being lost. I can't even explain this book in a way that does it justice. You just have to experience it for yourself. It's such a profound rejection of Western storytelling and Western gender roles in favor of bringing forth this deeply uncomfortable and disturbing picture of obsessive friendship. The writing itself is very mercurial and dreamlike, which makes sense because so much of the story is about this dream world and its dream rules that the characters are building together. And in so many ways, it's just a perfect execution of language. I do also have to take this opportunity to once again shout about You Dreamed of Empires by Alvaro Enrique. This is a mixture of magical realism, surrealism, horror, and ancient historical fiction. It's set in 1519 as Hernán Cortés and his Spanish army are entering the ancient city of Tenochtitlan. There he comes face to face with Moctezuma, one of the biggest rulers of the Triple Alliance, and it's basically a twisted colonial revenge story as these two rulers try to stake their claim and assert their dominance. If you've been around since January, you've heard me gush about this one multiple times. I was even invited to talk about it on NPR with my friends Carmen and Robin because we loved it that much. But I honestly have not stopped thinking about this one, not only because of its very intentional reclamation of indigenous history in Mexico, but because it challenges the very concept of conquering or being conquered in really interesting, disruptive ways. It's flipping the colonizer's script in so many ways, and it really goes to some bizarre, interesting places by the end that will make you question everything. It is brilliant. Our next category is dark fairy tales, and we're going to very appropriately start with Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. This is an original fairy tale fantasy story about Mara, who spent many years watching her sister suffer at the hands of an abusive prince, and when she realizes that no one is coming to rescue them like in the storybooks, then she will have to save them herself. She seeks out a powerful grave witch who offers Mara the tools she needs to kill a prince, but only if she can complete 3 impossible tasks. If you love twisted fairy tale stories and you're not reading T. Kingfisher, I don't really know what you're doing with your life. She can do it all. She can do retellings and reimaginings, but she also has such a knack for crafting these fantasy stories that feel like original fairy tales, but also have teeth. She's so good at somehow blending together whimsy and sinister tension, and I think that's definitely one of the highlights for this story as well. This is one of those stories about a ragtag group of unlikely heroes desperately and doggedly seeking justice against all odds, which I love so much. It's just satisfying to follow them on this traditional yet innovative magical quest. Secondly, I have to recommend The Last Tale of the Flower Bride by Roshni Chokshi. This is Roshni Chokshi's adult debut. It's like a modern-day fairy tale with gothic elements about an unnamed scholar of myths who crosses paths with Indigo, a beautiful and mysterious heiress. They eventually marry, contingent on the promise that the bridegroom will never look into Indigo's past. But when they learn that Indigo's estranged aunt is dying, they're forced to return to Indigo's childhood home, where the bridegroom will soon learn that he can no longer resist the lure of his wife's deeply deeply held secrets. In my humble opinion, Roshni Chokshi is a master of writing deeply evocative prose and pulling forth this dreamy, atmospheric imagery that really grounds you in the story and makes you feel immersed in what's happening on the page. This is what I would call another original modern fairy tale. It pays homage to the romantic pool of mythology and fairy tales, but it brings its own perspective to the table and makes you feel deeply unsafe as the story slowly unfurls itself and progresses. Next we have witchy books, and I want to start with a recent read of mine, which was The Witches of El Paso by Luis Jaramillo. This is a mixture of contemporary magical realism and historical fiction, and it's about a lawyer named Marta whose great aunt just experienced a bizarre house fire, and so Marta has to take her in while they sort everything out. This great aunt has always been known to have supernatural powers, although not everyone in her family has always believed in magic. She tells Marta that when she was a young girl, her powers transported her back to colonial Mexico, where she learned to tap into her magic, lived out her youth, and ultimately had a child who she had to leave behind when she finally came back to her own time. Now Marta's own powers are slowly beginning to awaken, and her great aunt tells her that they have to join forces to find her lost daughter across the far reaches of time and space. Like I said, I read this one recently and really enjoyed it. It's exactly the kind of family saga that I really love to read. The structure of the story is great as it oscillates back and forth between Marta discovering her powers and reconnecting with her great aunt in the present day, and scenes of Nena, her great aunt, living in 1700s Mexico and being taken in by a coven of witches masquerading as nuns. Besides the plot itself, I love what the story has to say about how society has feared and reviled feminine power across the ages. I also think it's cool that Marta is coming into her powers later in life and realizing she still has the capacity and opportunity to learn and do new things. It's a fascinating take on a multi-generational family saga, looking at the ways that dark occult magic has both derailed and healed the course of this family over time in so many ways. And my second witchy recommendation is none other than Where the Dark Stands Still by A.B. Poranek. So this is a much lighter take on witchy folklore. It's an enchanting, cozy YA fantasy story with a touch of romance about a girl named Lishka who's always been taught that her magic is unwieldy, unnatural, and dangerous. After accidentally hurting one too many people with her magic, she decides to venture into the dark forest because she's heard tales about a mystical flower, and whoever finds this flower will be granted one wish. Lishka, of course, wants to wish away her magic for good, but before she can, she's caught by the demon warden of the woods who offers her a bargain. If she can make it through a year of service in his woodland manor, he will grant her wish. I know I just gushed about this one in my September wrap-up, but I just really want so many more people to read it. It really and truly does give off the same vibes as Miyazaki's Howl's Moving Castle, but in book form and told through the lens of Polish folklore. But there is so much warmth and light to this story about these two lost souls who don't even realize they're searching for a place to finally set down their burdens, and that's what they find in each other. It's extremely whimsical and magical. There's a sentient woodland manor, friendly house spirits, magical creatures turned found family, the whole 9 yards. Yes, it will make you feel a whole range of things, but it's also just a delight. Speaking of things that are a delight, our next category is cozy fantasy, and very appropriately, we're going to start with In Deeper Waters by F.T. Lukens. A lot of people mistakenly think this book is about queer pirates, which I totally understand, but it's actually more of a fairy tale retelling and a satirical, tongue-in-cheek fantasy romance. It's about Prince Tal, who's finally embarking on his coming-of-age tour across the kingdom, which is a welcome change for him since he's been forced to hide in the palace so that no one finds out he has forbidden magic. So he's enjoying his first taste of adventure when he and his crew discover a mysterious prisoner aboard a sinking vessel and decide to rescue this person. And in getting tangled up with this beautiful stranger, Tal finds himself kidnapped in return and held ransom in a plot to reveal his powers. I always say this, but when it comes to cozy, satirical, queer fantasy, F.T. Lukens is one of the premier names in the game. You can pretty much swap out this book for any of their books if you're looking for a fun fantasy romp to read this fall, but In Deeper Waters was the first of their books that I read, so it has a special place in my heart. It's so much fun to read, it's wildly adventurous, it's constantly subverting expectations, and I think there's a really great romance between Tal and Athlin, who've both been taught to hide certain parts of themselves, and who are teaching each each other not to give so much weight to those things about themselves they can't change. I also wanted to include this category of cozy fantasy so that I could finally give A Far Wilder Magic by Alison Saft some well-deserved flowers. This is quite literally a Full Metal Alchemist Royai fantasy AU, but it's set in this wild woodland fantasy world that very much stands on its own. The story is following a sharpshooter named Margaret who desperately wants to join the Half Moon Hunt for the mythical creature known as the Hala, and part of her believes that if she joins the hunt and wins the coveted prize, her mother will have to finally come home. However, people can only officially join in teams of 2, with both a sharpshooter and an alchemist. So when a grungy, aspiring alchemist named Weston shows up on Margaret's doorstep in search of an apprenticeship with her mother, Margaret begrudgingly allows him to stay if he will team up with her to join the hunt. Listen, I think this story qualifies as cozy not only because it's set in this historical woodland fantasy world and feels incredibly atmospheric, but because a great deal of this story is very domestic. It's about these 2 stubborn characters who are desperate to prove themselves, sharing space in Margaret's house, learning how to better hone their skills, discovering how to work together, and of course, falling for each other in the process. Even though this is a fantasy story and there is an action-forward plotline with this hunt going on in the background, I feel like the strongest overarching plotline is the growing relationship between Margaret and Weston. They're both incredibly resistant to accepting help from other people, allowing other people to see their weaknesses or their failings or see behind the walls they put up. So as the story goes on, they just have such a beautiful connection, and that's what I still think about to this day. Next, let's move on to epic fantasy / high fantasy, and the first fantasy I would recommend is To Shape a Dragon's Breath by Monoquill Blackgoose. This is a tremendous fantasy story about a young indigenous woman who lives on a remote island where dragons haven't been seen for generations, until she finds a dragon's egg and the dragon bonds with her when it hatches. To her people, Anakus is revered as Nampesha-Wayasit, a person with a unique, prosperous, and sacred relationship to a dragon. However, the English conquerors have very strict ideas about how dragons should be raised. When they learn about Anakus's dragon, they force her to leave her people and enroll in a proper English dragon school, where if she cannot learn to tame her dragon will be killed. This is such a great book, and I cannot wait for the next installment in the series. It's an epic fantasy without a doubt, but it also has this really great slice-of-life quality to the story as Anakus is making friends, attending classes, and trying to find her way in this school that was very much not designed with someone like her in mind. Anakus is an incredibly strong and morally aligned person as well. She knows exactly who she is and what she believes in, and it's refreshing to see her stand by that again and again, no matter what trials she has to endure and no matter how difficult things might get. Overall, it's just such a satisfying fantasy adventure that makes great use of the magical school trope from a deeply decolonial perspective, which is a very needed and refreshing take. My second recommendation is Asunder by Kirsten Hall, which I think is perfect for the season in so many ways. It's about Karis Eska, who is a death speaker locked into a compact with a terrifying eldritch being who grants her the magic to communicate with the recently deceased. She makes her living by investigating strange deaths around the city, but when her most recent investigation goes sideways, she not only accidentally discovers a horrific new species and tangles herself up in a complex political conspiracy, but she also accidentally binds herself to a dying stranger who might just be her only chance at uncovering the truth. If any part of that appeals to you, even in the slightest, I am begging you to read this book. I cannot stop thinking about it, and I want you to think about it too. It's a dark and twisted fantasy horror in so many ways, but it's also a whimsical fantasy adventure at times with really strong elements of found family and deliciously unattainable romance. If you love pining, if you love yearning, you really have to read this. And I just love Karis's journey in this story. She starts off as a closed-off, cynical person who doesn't allow herself to get close to anyone, but her desperation to not only survive, but to live actually belies an unshakable sense of hope that she's clinging onto for some reason, even when everything seems utterly hopeless. Keep in mind, I could have included so many more categories and so many more books in each category, but for today, I'm going to close out with some non nonfiction recs. Like I said, I think fall is a time of renewal. It's a time for learning new things or looking at the world differently as it changes. Plus, there's Nonfiction November, and I just feel like nonfiction also gets a little bit more popular as the year closes. So my first recommendation couldn't be anything other than It Came from the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror, edited by Joe Velisi. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's an anthology of personal essays from queer writers who have all chosen one horror movie to analyze and discuss. And through exploring these specific films in depth, they're also drawing connections between monstrosity, body horror, violence, and fear to their own experiences and expressions of queerness. This is just a great read for fall in so many ways, in large part because we have the Halloween season, of course. This is the season where people are reaching for horror and thrillers both in visual media and textual media. The days are turning darker, and so you might be drawn to darker material as well. And if that's you, this would be a great choice. I love the variety of essays and topics in this anthology. It spans between classic horror and modern horror, and there's a lot of different entry points for understanding why queer folks especially might be drawn to horror stories, largely in part because our queerness is often used as fuel for fear-mongering and depicted as horrific in and of itself. And overall, it's just an incredibly cohesive, thought-provoking, and insightful collection that anyone can enjoy, whether you love horror or not. And lastly, for today, I want to once again recommend the absolute masterpiece that is Braiding Sweetgrass by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is an incredible book where the author, who is both a botanist and a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, explores how plants and elements of nature are our oldest teachers who have so much to offer us. It's beautifully written and very thoughtfully delivered. I absolutely recommend the audiobook as well, which is read by the author and is just such a pleasure to listen to. Each chapter is broken up into 3 sections: growth and function, connection to Indigenous values, and a personal story from the author's own life. It's just a stunningly profound blend of memoir and manifesto that encourages us to value the space we take up and understand that everything and everyone in the world and in nature is inherently connected, which is deeply complex, but also an incredibly beautiful thing that we should value and protect. Also, Dr. Kimmerer has a new book coming out this November, so if you've already read and loved Braiding Sweetgrass, just like I have, then you can look forward to that. So those are my fall reading recommendations. If you have any books in mind that encompass those fall vibes, or if you have any other recommendations that would fit into these categories, feel free to share them in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.